Hey team, we're going to learn how we can bring personalization to our Next.js Jamstack app using Uniform. I'm Colby Fayok, and if this is your first time here, make sure you hit subscribe and click that little notification bell for future updates. This video is sponsored and brought to you by Uniform. While we're about to get started learning how we can integrate Uniform into our application, make sure you head over to uniform.dev where you can really learn about all the different features that they provide as part of a digital experience platform. This includes not only the personalization that we'll learn about today, but a ton of different integrations bringing together a mesh of different types of content like sanity.io and commerce engines where it can really pull together all this into one powerful platform that'll give us the ability to give the power back to the people who are actually managing the content, such as business users. If you want to learn more about personalization and strategy for that personalization, head to the description and check out the personalization strategy workbook from Uniform. So for our walkthrough, we're going to learn how to use Uniform's Canvas tool, which not only allows us to actually construct our page using a composition of components, but we're also able to personalize each and every one of those components. Using Uniform's Optimize toolset on top of the canvas, we're going to be able to create intents, which is basically what somebody is intending to do or accomplish once they actually visit your page. Each intent is created using a series of signals, where that signal might be something like a URL parameter or a value from a cookie, where it's basically trying to determine their behavior as to why they would be more interested in that particular intent than a different intent. But to pull that all together, we're going to use Next.js, which is a React framework, which gives us a ton of capabilities as developers to build experiences for the web. Particularly, we're going to start off with this demo blog home starter that I created, which is really just a starting point with some blog posts and even a newsletter sign up form that's really just a link right now, but it's really just an example that we're going to be able to use to learn how we can integrate Uniform and how it actually works. Now you can find this link in the description if you want to follow along, but we're going to get started by running this yarn command, or you can use npx. We're going to head over to our terminal, we're going to paste that in, where we're going to use create next app, which is going to take this project, clone it down, and create it for a starting point for us. So I'm also going to pass in a name for this project, and I'm going to call it my uniform blog. So what this is going to do, again, it's going to clone down that project locally for us. It's going to install all the dependencies, reset Git history, and really just get us started so we can hit the ground running. But once it's done, I can now cd into that directory, and I can even run yarn dev, which is going to spin up a local development server for us, where as soon as I open that up, Next.js is going to start compiling the page in the background. But we can see that as soon as it's done loading, we have this really simple blog, which is just some sample content from my site, spacejelly.dev, where it also has this link for a newsletter. It's really just some sample content that we'll be able to use to get started. Now, before we dive into actually installing Uniform, we can head over to our pages, and inside of the index.js, really, again, there's really nothing special here. We're literally creating a series of posts just based off of static data inside of this post file, but really we're just rendering this content to the page. And this little widget here where we see our newsletter sign up form is what we're going to personalize as part of our example. So in order to get started with Uniform, the very first thing that we need to do is create a new Uniform project. So if this is your first time actually logging in, you'll see this exact same UI, but if you aren't, just make sure you click that red button, which is going to help you create a new project. So I'm going to start going through, and I'm going to call this my blog, and we can see that we have a few options for how we want to start our project. Now we're going to skip over the demo portion as we're going to do this all ourselves, but we can see that we can also start a new project for development, and we're going to select empty project instead of the guided setup. We want the empty project, and we're going to hit continue. Once the page reloads, we can see that we have our new project, and we can now navigate inside of our project. So when we're creating our new page, we're going to have a couple different things that we want to create, where we have our components along with the composition, which we'll get into in a second, but we also have our intents, which is how we personalize. But we're going to start off with actually just building the UI in the first place. So we can either create our first component or head over to the Canvas tab. Where to get started, let's first create our actual component. So I'm going to head over to the component library, and I'm going to click the big red button to create a new component. Now, if you're familiar with the React world, we can kind of think of the component just like a React component, right? Where we're going to have a component name, and we're going to have some props that align to that, which are going to be our parameters. But to get started, let's first create our component name. I'm going to call it call to action, and we can see that the public ID automatically generates, so we don't really need to worry about that. Some of these other configuration options are optional. One thing, do not check the composition component. We'll get into that in a little bit here, but for this call to action, we do not want it checked. But then we're going to head over to the parameters. Now again, we can think of our parameters as props, as they will actually map to props when we're trying to integrate this. So we want to create a new prop for each piece of content that we want to add inside of our project. Now, if we look inside of our project, we can see our widget where we have 4 pieces of information that we want to be able to configure, where we have our headline, we have our body that's going to have some copy for us, we're going to have a link for the call to action, and the title of the call to action. So we're going to create 4 different parameters which are going to serve as our props. So let's go ahead and click that big red button where the first parameter name is going to be headline, where we can see again the public ID auto generates, so we can leave that as is, but we want to change the type, which we do have a few options, but we want to select text as ultimately we're going to be putting text in there. And while we do have other options such as validation, we're going to skip that for now, and we're just going to hit OK, and we can see that we have our first parameter. Now, I jumped ahead here, so you don't have to just watch me fill out all 4 of those parameters, but we can see that I created my 4 parameters, which are going to serve as our props, where I have a headline, my body, my link URL, and my link title, all as a type of text. Now, one thing just to point out before we continue on, while we're not going to cover integrations in this particular walkthrough, this becomes much more powerful when we can start to configure these different parameters to come from data from other integrations, such as if we were using Sanity for our CMS, we can configure this type to come directly from Sanity, which becomes super powerful as we're pulling together all those integrations for our content. But for now, that's all we need for our first call to action component. So I'm going to click save and close, and we can see that we land right on the component library page. So next, we're going to create a composition, where a composition is technically a component, where you can think of it as an instance of a component. So we're going to create our composition by first starting off by building a component. So I'm again going to click that big red button to create a new component, but this time I'm going to call it page. And as we mentioned before, we see our public ID auto generate, but the first thing we want to do is we want to actually check this composition component field that we did not check before, where this is going to say to Uniform that we want to use this page component as a composition. Now, instead of defining parameters or props for this composition, we want to define slots, where slots is basically going to be dynamic pieces where we're going to be able to inject different components so that we can really create a dynamic experience within that composition without having to change the actual code anytime we want to move something around. Now, if we look back at our blog for a second, we can try to start to think about how this is coming together, where the entire page is going to be our composition, where it's going to be that page composition particularly, where inside we're going to have different areas, where you can think of slots kind of like maybe the headline or title of the site, or this area where we're going to change our widget, whether it's going to be a newsletter or follow on social media, but we're going to create this area as something generalized so that we can put whatever we want. So how about we call it promo, where it's something that we can put something promotional, such as our newsletter, or if we want to promote a product. So back on my composition component page, I'm going to click the red button in the slots tab, where now I'm going to create my slot called promo. Now, for now, we can really set the amount of different components that we're allowed to have in this area, but if we look at the page that we're working with, I probably only want to have one component at a time because I don't want things stacking up inside that promo box that really would take on the entire page. So I'm going to actually define it as 0 as a minimum. I'm going to set a maximum of 1. Where then if we look down, we can see what components we actually allow, where in our case, we see our call to action component, which we just created, where we also want to select this personalization setting, which this is going to be how we can actually personalize that different slot to different things that a user might want to see when they're visiting the site. But once you have all the configurations done, we can hit OK, and we can now see that we have our new slot. We can scroll back up to the top, and we can hit save and close. Now finally, to finish creating our active composition, we're going to head over to the composition section, where we're going to click that red button to create a new composition, and we're going to select the type of composition as the page that we just created. Now we can give this whatever name we want, but I know that we're showing this on our homepage, so I'm going to call this composition the homepage simply, and I'm going to click create. Now, once it's done, we're dropped into what Uniform calls its canvas, where here is going to be where we're actually going to configure what's going to go on inside of that particular composition and how we can actually make it dynamic. Now, to start, we can see our promo slot here where we want to add our new component. So I'm going to click this green button and we can see that we have our components listed here where I'm going to select call to action and we can immediately see that we have those fields that we can fill out. Now, just as a reminder, if we had an integration set up such as a CMS, we would be able to pull this content from a CMS. But just for this example, so that we can have an easy way to walk through this, we're just going to leave it as manually editable fields for now. But what we're doing right now is recreating our current newsletter widget. So we're going to just copy and paste the same content that we're using. So I'm going to head over to my IDE. And I'm going to start copying and pasting things over, such as my headline, which is sign up for my newsletter. Oops, I got to fix that L there. Then my body, which is going to be get the latest tutorials straight to your inbox. The link URL, which is going to be my newsletter link. And then learn more for the call to action title. And make sure you're filling this out with your own information so that you can have your own example for what we're doing. But we're not going to quite click personalize this yet. This is going to be our default experience. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to click save and publish, which is going to save all the content that I just added, and it's going to actually publish it and make it available. Now, just as a note, even if a composition is in draft mode, we can still grab that using the API, but for our use case, we want to be working with production data, so that's why we're actually making sure we're also publishing it. Now, finally, as one last thing, while we can actually grab the ID from the URL in order to programmatically look this up, a little bit easier of a way to do this when we move to our code is to add a slug. So in this top left section, we're going to click this green button or click inside, and we're going to call our slug homepage, or really whatever you want. Basically, it's going to be our ID that we use to look up this composition. And again, let's click save and publish. So now that we have our default experience set up, let's actually now move into our Next.js application and get this on our page. Now, in order to make it a little easier to follow along with the actual commands that we're going to copy and paste in for getting our dependencies, you can either use the written tutorial that I have along with this video in the description, or additionally in the description, you can find Uniform's tutorial where they walk you through how to do this, where particularly we want to know how we can get the actual dependencies. So we're going to look for this step 2, and I'm going to scroll all the way down there where we can see that we want to add all these dependencies. Particularly, we're going to be adding the Canvas React, and the CLI, which we can head over to our terminal. I'm going to paste that right inside, and it's going to start to install those dependencies that we can then use in the project. So now that our dependencies are installed, we want to actually get started to importing those dependencies. So first, I'm going to import my Canvas client from @uniform dev/canvas. Next, I'm going to actually duplicate that line because we're going to import from Canvas React, where we're going to import the composition as well as the slot. Now, while we have a lot of options for how we actually get our data using the Canvas client into our application, we're going to use get static props because that's a great way to statically fetch all that data and use it in our application. So I'm going to head all the way down to the bottom of this page, and I'm going to export a new async function called get static props, where inside of that, I'm going to return a new object that has a props property, which is where we're going to return all that data that we send to our page. Next, we want to use the Canvas client, and we're going to create a new instance of it so that we can actually configure our application. So I'm going to say constant client equals new Canvas client, where inside we want to pass our configuration, where we're going to have two things. We're going to have our API key, and we're going to have our project ID. Now, these are things that we likely don't want to store actually inside the project. So I'm going to create environment variables to do that, where I'm going to create process.env.uniform API key. I'm going to also create a second process environment variable where I'm going to call that project, capitalize, project ID. Now we're going to get these values in a second here, but before we do, let's finish out the code where we're going to next use this client to use a function where we're going to say client get composition by slug, where inside we're going to pass in the slug, which our ID is homepage, as we remember, but then we want to make sure that we're actually getting that data from the client that we're going to await, as it's going to be an asynchronous request, where instead of adding this data constant, I'm going to already destructure the composition right from this request. Finally, we can take this composition and we can pass it right in as our prop, as that's how we'll access it inside of the app. So next, let's get started with those environment variables, where to do this, I'm going to create an environment file called .env. And to be clear, typically in Next.js, we're going to use a .env local if you follow along with any of my other examples, but it's important that we use .env specifically and not env local so that our CLI for Uniform can work properly and find this file. But either way, we want to create our .env file, and we're going to create two environment variables. We're going to have our Uniform API key, and we're going to have our Uniform project ID. We're back inside of Uniform. We want to now create our API key. The way we can do that is we're going to navigate up to our team page where we're going to select settings. And we can see here that we have API keys where we're going to now create a new API key where let's describe this project as my blog or whatever you're going to be able to remember this specific project as. And then we're going to want to add permissions to my blog. Now, inside of the permissions, we have three specific permissions that we want to add. Now, inside of the top composition section, we want to select read draft and read published. And then we want to scroll down under Uniform Optimize under the intent manifest, where we want to also be able to read the intent manifest. But once we're done there, we can go ahead and click create API key, where we can see that we're given that API key, where we're going to copy that and paste it inside of our application because they're not going to give us the ability to see that again. So if you lose this API key, you'll have to create another one. But we can see that they also give us our project ID, which we can also copy inside of our application. But I'll show you in a second how we can additionally find this if you don't get this the first time when we're creating our key. Now, if you want to find your project ID outside of the API key creation process, we can head over to our project, head over to the settings tab, and if we scroll down on that first generic or general page, we'll be able to see that project ID that we can copy right into our page. Now, before we move on, one other thing to keep in mind is because we're using .env, make sure that inside of your git ignore that you actually have that .env inside of there. You don't want to commit these files to GitHub or your favorite Git provider, as you don't want these to be exposed and compromised when you're using your account keys in here. But now that we have our environment variables set up, let's actually try to see what this looks like. So up at the top of the page, I'm going to now create that composition prop, and let's add a console log statement to see what's inside. Now, if your development server is running, make sure you restart it to pick back up those environment variable settings. But now if we refresh the page and we open up our web console, we can see that we are now getting that composition, where we can see it's a type of page, and we can even see our slots where we have our promo slot with the call to action. Now, we can certainly manually map through that, but that's not the point here, right? We're going to actually use the Uniform Component API to use this composition data. So to do that, let's create this new component above our old component just so we can see how it's coming together. I'm going to create a new composition component where I'm going to also close that composition component. But inside of there, we're going to use the data prop and we're going to pass right in that composition data that we just pulled in from the props. Now we want to also define our slot inside of that composition. So we're going to add the slot component and we're going to say the name of that is promo, as that's the area that we're going to be customizing. Now to actually define the UI for this component, we're going to go back to the composition component and we're going to define a new prop called resolve renderer, where we're going to pass in a function to that, which is going to return a component. Now you'll likely want to reorganize this once you have your system figured out, but for now I'm going to create a new constant called default component, where I'm going to set up just a simple empty component to start, and I'm going to then return that default component. But then I'm going to copy and paste this signup widget directly inside of that new component, and we're gonna actually be able to see that we're going to be able to define our props for all the different data we're gonna get from that composition data, including our headline, our body, our link URL, and our link title, which, as we can imagine, we're going to take all these props and we're going to replace all of the different data nodes that we have inside of here, so that what we're going to be doing is we're going to actually be dynamically passing in those values that pulled in right inside of Uniform. So we can see we're going to finish up with our link here, where we have our link URL and our link title. And we can see that now all of that data is being pulled in dynamically. So now once we head back into our page, we can now see that we have two newsletter sign up widgets. And we can actually see the one has the correct spelling of newsletter because I fixed that inside of Uniform. So we know that it's actually working properly because of that typo. But that said, we can now get rid of our manual one, and next we'll be able to see how we can do that dynamically. So first I'll get rid of that static component. Now we're ready to go. So next we're going to get started at the personalization, where we can see here on the personalization tab, we have our intents, which our intents are going to be the action or whatever our visitor intends to do when they come to the site. Now our default experience, you can define as signing up for a newsletter, where we don't actually have to define an intent for that because that's just the default experience, where we don't need to customize and make that dynamic based on the personalization. We instead want to define the intents for what happens if they're not trying to sign up for the newsletter. Now, we can think of this example as another thing, such as if somebody's already signed up for my newsletter, how about maybe I want them to try to sign up for social media? So how about we create a new intent called follow on social media? So I'm going to click this red button and we're going to name our intent follow on social media, and you can add a description if you want, but we can see that this is going to be what we're going to use to show a social media following experience inside that widget. So I'm going to click save, and we can see that we were now dropped into a new section where we're going to want to add signals. Now, signals are basically going to be the attributes or what type of things define why somebody would be more likely to want to see the follow on social media experience rather than the newsletter sign up. Now, in this simple case, how about if they're already a newsletter sign up or subscriber to my newsletter, we want to show the follow on social media. So our signal can simply be that they're a newsletter subscriber. So I'm going to go ahead and click this red button, and the way that we're going to do this is we're going to use the query string parameter, where let's call this is newsletter subscriber. And because we're using the query string parameter here, one common way to define this is using UTM values, which is a Google Analytics way of actually defining the different types of things like campaign or the source or the medium for where the actual link was coming from. Now, in this instance, we're going to use UTM source, which in this case, we're going to call newsletter. So the source of this visitor, where the link they clicked, is the newsletter, and we can be pretty confident that they are a subscriber because they're coming from the newsletter. Now, as we go down, we can see that we have some configuration options. We're not going to go too deep into other options, but we can see that not only can we create a signal that's going to increase the likelihood, we can also decrease the likelihood. Now, think of it as like a score, where we're increasing that score or we're decreasing that score. Basically, the higher the score of the signals for somebody for an intent means we're going to show that particular intent. So we're going to leave this as the default for now, but we're going to scroll to the bottom and we're going to click save, and we can see that we now have our new signal for our follow on social media intent. Now, following on social media is a great example of how we can do this, but what if we were running a particular campaign, a marketing campaign, where we want to show people particular products based on if they're associated with that campaign? Now, as an example, if I'm marketing Jamstack content, maybe I want to show products related to the Jamstack, such as my book, Jamstack Handbook. So let's create a new intent. Let's call it check out my book, where it's going to be about the Jamstack. So I'm going to create a new intent. Let's call it check out Jamstack book. We can describe it if we'd like, but I'm going to click save, and we can add our new signal where we're going to again use query string, but this time instead of UTM source, we're going to use UTM campaign. Now that campaign, again, we're defining as a URL parameter where we're going to call that Jamstack, where then we'll know that any link that comes in here is associated with that campaign. So we can also call it Jamstack campaign. Now, similar to before, we're just going to leave all the settings as a default because we're really just working through this, but definitely feel free, and I encourage you to play around with these because ultimately this score is what helps the personalization create the experiences that are right for that person visiting the application. So I'm going to go ahead and click save, and we can see that we now have our signal for our checkout Jamstack book. And if I head over to intents, we now have our two intents, which we're going to be able to personalize our content. So I'm going to go ahead and click publish, and we can actually get started using our new intents. Now, to use these intents, we're going to head back over to our canvas, where specifically our homepage canvas, where we can now see that if we head over to our call to action, we're going to scroll down and we're going to click personalize this. And we can see that now we have a little bit different of a structure where our call to action, our default call to action, is now nested under that personalization. Now this personalization is going to be where we can add the different experiences based on the intent. And we can see also we have this add intent tag on the right here, where again, for our default experience, we're not going to define an intent, but for our alternate experiences, we're going to add an intent so we know when to show those. So if we start to hover over our current component, we can see we get the plus sign. So we're going to go ahead and click that again, where we're going to select our call to action component, just like before. So now we can start filling this out as if we were trying to get somebody to follow us on social media. So we'll say get updates straight from Twitter. And how about maybe for the body, don't want to wait for the weekly newsletter. I'm going to fix that typo quick. We'll say get live updates right from Twitter. Or then our link, https twitter.com/colbyfayok, and our link title, how about follow on Twitter. And then finally, we can see we have that add intent tag at the bottom again. This time we are going to select that, and we can see we have those two intents that we added. Now, of course, we want to select follow on social media, where we can now see that this particular call to action is targeted for that intent. Now I'm going to go ahead and add my other component. I went ahead and skipped ahead and added all the content, but this time we want to make sure we're adding the right intent. And in this case, it's going to be check out the Jamstack book. Now, finally, we have our components, but before we can actually move forward, we actually see that we currently have an invalid configuration. We have one more thing to do, and that's go ahead and click on the personalization component here, where we need to give a name so that Uniform has something to use when they're keeping track of all the analytics. So how about let's just call this homepage promo CTA, something simple that we know exactly what it is. But once that's ready, we can go ahead and, like before, click save and publish, where we're now going to be able to take advantage of this personalized experience. Now, if we try to go to those URL parameters, we're going to see that we don't quite get that experience yet. And that's because we're currently only doing everything statically, where we need to also add a tracking mechanism for Uniform to be able to come in here and actually gauge what the kind of visitor is to see if they match that particular intent to show the right content. Now, again, we're going to head over to the Uniform docs or follow along with my written tutorial, but we want to add this new dependency for our optimize tracker, which is going to allow to do that. Now, we're going to add this client side for our personal walkthrough here, but you can also do things like edge computing or server-side rendering, which can really bring another level to this experience. But to start, I'm going to go ahead and copy this dependency command, and I'm going to paste it into my terminal so we can now add the optimize tracker. Now, before we actually dive into the code, I'm going to scroll all the way down and I'm going to first configure my manifest script, where here, what this script is going to do is it's going to use the Uniform CLI, which we already installed, and it's going to pull down our manifest, which is going to have all the descriptions of the intents. So that way we don't have to load this client side and put that expense on the actual visitor of the site. Instead, we're going to preload that so that we can provide all those details to Uniform when the application loads. So to do that, we can see that we're going to run this command Uniform Optimize Manifest, where we're going to run download with the output of the file path. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this script as is, and over inside of my package.json, I'm going to go ahead and add that new script, where the only thing that we want to make sure we do is we want to make sure that we're pointing that location to exactly where we want to store the intent manifest.json. Now, you can really store this wherever you want, but I already have this data folder in my project, so I'm going to install it inside of the data folder as well. So I'm going to replace lib with data, and because we're running this from the root, it's going to store that inside of data/intent manifest.json. Now, just as a reminder, we created our file as .env so the CLI command can properly see our environment variables. So now if we run that script with yarn manifest or npm run manifest, we can see that Uniform is going to run that command. We can see that it was saved into that file, where now if we open up that folder, we can see that we have our intent manifest, where we have our follow on social media, along with the different configurations for each of those intents and how Uniform will actually use them. So rather than typing these out manually, because there's a couple of them, I'm going to go ahead and just copy these import statements from this tutorial. Again, you can use my written tutorial in the description if you prefer, but either of these options are available as links inside of the description. But I'm going to head over to my project, and I'm going to instead open up app.js, which this is going to be our custom app file, which we're going to be able to use to wrap our Next.js application with whatever we want. And in this instance, we're going to wrap it with our uniform tracker. So at the very top, I'm going to import all of those different components. I'm also going to get rid of the comments as I don't need them, but we can see that we're importing our uniform tracker from this Optimize package. We're creating a default tracker module, which we'll use, and then we're also importing that intent manifest. Now, because we moved that location from the default location, we're going to update this to data instead of that lib location. That way it's able to find it when it compiles. So next, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a local tracker instance. So I'm going to copy this function, create default tracker. I'm going to say constant local tracker is equal to create default tracker. And I'm going to actually pass right in this intent manifest as is. Make sure that it's camel case if you're doing the same thing. Otherwise, set it as a property if you have different conventions. Next, I'm going to actually wrap this component with my uniform tracker. So first I'm going to add my parentheses so that I can easily do that. But then around that component, I'm going to add my uniform tracker and make sure that it's completely wrapped inside the app. So next we want to define the tracker instance for uniform tracker. So we're going to add a prop of tracker instance, and we're going to simply pass in our local tracker. But now that's all we had to do, and we now have our Next.js application configured for tracking. So let's see what that actually looks like. So if I head over back to my blog and I refresh the page, we can see that it's really still showing that default experience. But that's expected because we don't want anything to happen if we don't know what the person's intent is. But let's say, for example, if we add UTM source equals newsletter, where we know this person is coming from our newsletter, again, our signal is that they're a newsletter subscriber, we know that we want to show the intent of follow on social media. And we can see that's exactly what we're showing. We're showing that we want that person to follow on Twitter because we know that it's useless to show the newsletter subscriber sign up again. Now, similarly, if I knew that person was coming from a Jamstack campaign and I wanted to show them Jamstack related content, such as if I'm linking to a Jamstack related blog post and I want to show Jamstack related products like my book, we can see what that looks like when we use the UTM campaign parameter. Now, before we do this, because we already showed this intent of UTM source, we need to make sure we kind of reset the actual tracking experience. So I'm going to go back to that default URL. I'm going to head over to the application tab and I'm going to click clear site data so we can have a fresh start. But now I'm going to go and refresh. And this time I'm going to go to UTM campaign equals Jamstack. And this time we know that because our intent is to learn more about the Jamstack and check out this book, we can see that with the UTM campaign parameter of Jamstack, we get this experience for being able to learn more about that book. Now, personalization can become super powerful because you can use all these different signals, such as where people came from or what campaign they're associated with, to show these dynamic experiences using things that we actually expect those visitors to be interested in. And like I mentioned before, this is really just scratching the surface of what Uniform can provide, because we can really pull together all these different integrations and create a mesh of all of our different content and infrastructure where we can really communicate and personalize with this one platform. Personalization is a way to bring up another level of engagement for your visitors, whether it's just showing something they're interested in or showing something that you think is important to you for that particular visitor. What's your favorite use case of personalization? Is it simply showing some products that you might be interested in based off of your history, or is it something more complex? Let me know in the comments. If you want to learn more about personalization and really start to get a strategy for how all this works, make sure you check out Uniform's Personalization Strategy Workbook, which I'll have a link in the description. Or if you want to take your Next.js data fetching up to another level, where rather than just static data like we did today, you can use dynamic routes and dynamic data fetching such as server-side rendering, check out my video, Create Pages and Fetch Data in Next.js, where I walk you through creating an Avatar: The Last Airbender wiki. Thanks to Uniform for sponsoring, and if you like this video, make sure you hit thumbs up, subscribe, and click that little notification bell for future updates. Thanks for watching.